Welcome, fans, to another live edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast on the Hannibal TV on YouTube. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling. Pleased to have on a man today that right off the bat that I've been a fan of his work. He's a author, a wrestling historian, a long time and very successful podcaster, and he's really renowned for his deep knowledge of professional wrestling history, which fans of the Hannibal TV know that I do share that. But he's written some pretty tremendous books on some aspects of it that we're going to get into. We got a lot to get into, but without further ado, I want to welcome Dragon King Karl Stern. Karl, how are you doing today, sir?
Jack, I'm doing super great. It's an honor to be here on Hannibal TV. I've never got to be on Hannibal TV before, so this is a first for me, and it's an honor. I'm absolutely love the work that's done on Hannibal TV, and it's great for me to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, I appreciate that coming from such a historian as yourself, but you've been chronicling wrestling history for years through your podcasts and writing. What initially sparked your passion for professional wrestling?
It's a great question because it had a lot to do with where I grew up. I live in northern Alabama. I live less than an hour away from both Mississippi and Tennessee, and about an hour and a half from Birmingham. So I'm in the very northwest corner. And that was important in the early 1980s due to the fact this was a great place to be a pro wrestling fan, and also a bad place to be one because we didn't have cable TV. In fact, to this day, cable TV never came here. Satellite dishes, of course, did. So back then, our local pro sports was wrestling. We didn't have a pro sports team in Alabama, still don't. Mississippi, there are in Tennessee, but here, local community, local things that appeal to this area, well, that was Southeastern wrestling. I mean, Bob Armstrong was your great hometown babyface, and he appealed to people here. So you had the Armstrong family, the Fuller family, and here, which was great, was we also got on television. If you turn your television antenna to Tupelo, Mississippi, we got Jarrett's promotion out of Memphis. And also out of Huntsville, numerous, like the Crockett promotion, WWF syndicated. And while I never could get the TBS shows here at the time they were airing, I got such a wide variety. There was a point in time I could get up on Saturday morning, watch Southeastern wrestling, watch Memphis wrestling, watch Mid-South wrestling, watch whatever WWF had in syndication and NWA as well. I even got Puerto Rico for a while, weirdly enough. So it was a great place to learn about it. And being, I was born in 1971, so I was 10 years old in 1981. And perfect. I mean, that was the perfect time for the explosion of territories. World Class was another. And so I became a fan because everybody I knew and from school was a fan of wrestling. It was huge. And over the years, it just, while so many other people I know, and make no mistake, I like football and other sports too, but wrestling became just the thing that appealed to this area. And I loved it. I became a fan of it, an unapologetic fan of it. Went often to, I won't say often, but I went many times to Boutwell Auditorium in Birmingham for both Southeastern and later Continental. And over the years, I just, I tried to monetize whatever I was a fan of, be that comic books, action figures. I still run When It Was Cool, which is all types of retro pop culture, not just wrestling, because I was a fan of that stuff and I wanted to make it pay for itself. So I got into collecting comic books and selling those, going to wrestling. Eventually, I wrestled for about 3 or 4 years in the mid 1990s. I was terrible at it. I was big, clumsy, and realized my talent didn't lay there. I was broke into the wrestling business by a guy I'm sure you've heard of named Gentleman Ken Timms. And Ken Timms, he was a wrestler in many different promotions. And when I started in the early or the mid 1990s. I was a career law enforcement officer. I retired with 32 years of service from the police department. I was in fact chief of police at one point in time. So that, I like the physicality of it. I like the, being in there and working. I didn't work against a bunch of famous names. I got super kicked by Scott Armstrong once, and Bull Buchanan, I lost to him one time, but the rest of the people you'd never know. And I realized I wasn't athletically gifted enough to continue to do that. So we started to run shows instead, started to promote shows. And that was a big giant black hole to throw money in. So I started writing newsletters. I subscribed to the Observer, subscribed to the Torch, and in the early 1990s there were newsletters everywhere. Brian Alvarez, Figure 4, and so I'm like, I can, I know English a little bit, so I started doing newsletters, and eventually that just translated into website, internet work, podcasting, and however many years it's been since the Chris Benoit situation, the double murder suicide of him. That was actually my first week doing my podcast on Wrestling Observer.
Wow.
So I've been with them for 15 years or more, however long that's been. And I don't have a passion for current modern day wrestling. And but I'm not one of those people that says, "Oh, back in my day when it was real, it was great." None of that. It's for this generation. I mean, they understand, they relate to these folks. I don't. I related. Pop culture is that way. I mean, pop culture reflects what life is, and life reflects pop culture. And my life growing up, I'm now a man in my 50s. When I was a man in my 20s and 30s. Well, those things influence me. And today's isn't written for me. It's just like music. People say this music today is awful. It sucks. No, it's not for you. Journey, Styx, Rush, Eagles. They were writing my music about my life. I can't relate to this. So there's nothing wrong with it. If you're a fan of today's wrestling, I would never insult people by saying, "Hey, it's terrible." No, it's different, but it's what it is. And ever since the 1800s, wrestling has been in a endless state of reinventing itself based on the world around it, as you would expect.
Yeah, that's really funny you say that, because do a lot of podcasts on the Hannibal TV, and whenever the current product comes up, I always put that disclaimer on it too, that it's not something that I enjoy, but I'm not the demographic. So that's right. A very wise position to take. But I wanted to also right off the bat ask you this question, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing a number of wrestling historians, and I always find their approach to the research to be a very interesting part of the entire process. And that's, how do you separate the fact from the myth, especially in an industry where, kayfabe existed before and stories were embellished at times, let's say?
Well, I'm by no means any smarter or wiser than anybody else is, but I have a special skill set in that I spent 31 years of my life separating the fact from the fiction in people's stories. So I look at it from that perspective. Obviously, I can't teleport myself back to 1870 and with my own eyes determine if this match was real or fake. Even if we had video from then, which obviously we don't, it would be hard. I mean, how many generations have gone by with wrestling on videotape where people still are like, "Well, that was real," and that's so you wouldn't even know then. But what we can know is evidence. Okay, could I convict Colonel James H. McLaughlin and William Muldoon of being fake pro wrestlers? No, but I can make a case, and that surprised me. I fully expected the pioneers in the 1800s to be these real tough old pioneers out in a barn fighting it out to see who was the toughest of them all, because that's the imagery they wanted you to have. I never for a moment considered that wrestling could be worked back then. Why would it be? Obviously, for television, it's a thing. Obviously, movies aren't, quote, real. Well, why would they work something back then? And it turns out for a strange reason that made sense then, today you'd never think of, and that was gambling. People were betting on these matches, and it doesn't take even an ignorant man long to go, if you and I work together, we can make more money. Make it look like you're the tougher guy. Everybody's going to bet on you. Then I end up beating you, but we split the money, and that's how it came to be. I mean, wrestling got to be worked not to put on more exciting matches, although that came in the 1800s sooner than most people realize. The entertainment aspect of wrestling was well established by the 1880s. Professor Theobald Bauer and a guy he ran around with named Professor William Miller. Miller was from Australia. Bauer was from France. And he was an established French wrestling superstar over there. Europe had what we would recognize as pro wrestling a long time before we had it in the United States. And really, of all people, and they don't get credit for this, and I'm going to try to work with Dave Meltzer in the Observer Hall of Fame to maybe get some more pioneers recognized. And I think Professor Theobald Bauer and Miller are important. Muldoon and McLaughlin and those are already in, but the French connection to the origins of entertainment style wrestling, they were doing this in the circus. It was part of an act. You might have elephants in ring 1, trapeze artists in ring 2, and the French wrestlers would be in another ring putting on their show. And that's fine. We know what wrestling is, and that's great. But when it came to the United States, they were very successful in going coast to coast. They were as popular in San Francisco as they were in New York. And you think, how can this even be in a time without television? Well, the newspapers, if I were, and I've seen these in our, regional paper, the Birmingham News or whatever, I've saw the names, Professor Theobald Bauer and William Miller and William Muldoon and Colonel James, and they never wrestled a match ever in Alabama. But people knew who they were because that's how media worked in the 1800s. So these were famous people for their age. And I found it to be many red flags. The newspapers were openly skeptical about wrestling by the 1870s, not 1899, not the time of Hackenschmidt and Gotch, where they were saying, well, this might be. No, the 1870s, 1880s, more newspapers than not were calling wrestling a fake sport. Were calling it, they had a word for it. It was called hippodrome. Now, you may say, well, I know what a hippodrome is, Carl. It's a building. Well, that's what it became, and that's what it was named after, but it became an insider wrestling term that meant a fake match. We hippodromed. We put on a show. And that was in regular use by the 1870s and 1880s. In fact, you may not know, anybody who's involved with wrestling knows the term jobber. We know that's a person who loses regularly. Well, where's that term come from? The 1870s, where the newspapers were regularly calling matches put-up jobs. And later, we know this through Clarence Whistler, who was a big-time star in that era. He was also a rogue. He was that guy that would go to the newspapers and say, yeah, that was fake. We hippodromed that. We did. He was kind of an outlaw. And we know from him that got shortened from put-up job to the person losing doing the job, and later, of course, become jobber. So some of these terms, and I found that interesting, having, been around wrestlers for many years. There's even, you always heard Speak Carney. Now, it predates Carney. It goes way back. The circus influence really came with the French wrestlers a little bit later than the guys like John McMahon, no relation to the Vince McMahon family, but one of the original pioneers. In fact, John McMahon, Colonel James H. McLaughlin, William Muldoon, they're like your big three of the early to mid pioneer era. The people who actually established the origin and evolution of pro wrestling in America. Those three are your big ones. That's your Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, Steve Austin, whoever. that's of that era.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Before we get into your actual process for the 84 to 85 omnibus and the pioneer era of wrestling on omnibus, I'm going to spell that correctly sometime. Omnibus. What was your favorite era from the pioneer era to you mentioned off air your wheelhouse being about 2005. That's part A of the question, and part B is why was early 90s to mid 90s WCW so great? Because I know we share that.
Oh, absolutely. I would say my favorite era to study, without question, is the pioneer era, because there's so much new to learn. There's this isn't braggadocious or anything. It's the world we live in. We have TV, everything, podcasts, Hannibal TV, stuff like that. How much more is there really to know about 84, 85 that hasn't already been talked about? Now, there's nuances to it for sure, and I talk about those often, but there's not much left to mine out of that. But the pioneer era, there's a lot left to understand, and this is the foundation. We don't get here today without that. And so I think it's very important, and it's something that for years much mythology was about. Love the 1980s. I became really like 1982, 83, 84, 85. But that's probably my favorite years. But now I also really love the Monday Night War era. But then you get those little sweet spots like early 90s WCW. Well, wrestling wasn't very popular at the time. In fact, everybody was struggling, even WWF. WCW certainly was struggling. This is pre-Hulk Hogan coming in. That we got that late real burst of good stuff in 1989. You had the Ricky Steamboat, Ric Flair. You had Ric Flair, Terry Funk. You had some good stuff, but then creatively and financially, everybody just fell off a cliff. The WWF obviously had all the scandals going at that time, and it was and I've criticized many people for doing this. WCW was trying to be WWF light. They were like, let's have cartoon characters. Get a lumberjack and a bear, and let's walk in the ring. And while stuff like that was silly in hindsight, Oz and just crazy stuff like that. But there was also some really good stuff in there. I'm a huge big Van Vader fan. Loved Vader. I was enamored with him. Giant guy, just doing flips and everything. Who could not? I also like Stan Hansen. So, man, you put these two. I like the big powerhouse guys, the Steve Williams and the Terry Gordys of the world. I always like that class of wrestler. And that was a peak time for them. And so even though WCW couldn't really get their act together back then, there was some interesting stuff. Obviously, this was the heyday of Sting. I like Sting. I thought Sting was many years too late being inducted into the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. I was very much, and often shouted down, Sting, Carl, obviously you didn't read your Observer at the time. Sting was not good. I read it at the time, but I also have eyeballs, and I know what I like, and entertainment is subjective. We probably like some of the same music, and probably not, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I liked Sting. I thought Sting was exceptionally Hall of Fame worthy, and this was his time. I tell you somebody else that I think is criminally underrated, because when you think of Ron Simmons, most people think of Farouk in the time. And man, WCW champion Ron Simmons, had he had some people to work with, I'd have been 1,000% behind that, because I thought he had this great athletic career outside of wrestling. You just looked at the guy and knew if it was on, he could take most anybody around it. I don't know. He just come across to me as just a very tough guy. And
so he wasn't bad on the mic either. He was decent on the mic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I think he really suffered from not having that many great potential matches. Wasn't set up that well, because WCW was going through so much flux back then. But love that time. I just thought there was so many just diamonds in the rough you could see. Like, man, if wrestling was on a high point right now, your Stings, your Ron Simmons, Big Van Vaders, people, Barry Windham at that time, these people would have just owned the world had wrestling been on the top of the cycle rather than the bottom.
Before we get into your process, Lewis is asking, was it after Ring Magazine stopped covering wrestling due to its legitimacy being questioned was when the public started to know more?
I think, like the popularity of wrestling, the knowledge of how worked or legit it was has gone through cycles also. I think there was a time back in that early 1800 or mid 1800s, let's say 1860 to maybe 1880, where people, the magazines, and the people that went to the matches didn't believe, really. They were very skeptical. But then William Muldoon come around and really turned everything around. He made wrestling. Now, he wasn't all legit either, but he made it look that way, and he presented it in a very interesting way. And I think from that time all the way through Gotch Hackenschmidt, who were probably very real, the general public thought, yeah, this is real stuff. It's real. And then you go through another period of time where it seems like it is, and it seems like it's not. And you go through the Strangler Lewis era, Luthez, and then you get up into the TV era. And of course, people like, see Gorgeous George, and they think, it's a little more on the entertainment side. Well, then you get up in the 70s, and it's 60s and 70s. And it's very violent. I mean, pick up any newsstand magazine from the 60s and 70s, and you've got these blood. You'd never be on the newsstand nowadays. So people far too sensitive. People with blood on their face. These very famous Bobby Heenan covers where he's just grotesquely covered in blood, and people thought it's real in a way. It's real enough. It's real enough. I can suspend disbelief, no problem. And so, of course, that was the heyday of the magazines, really coming up through the 1980s, and there came a point, I feel like, by the late 1980s for sure, where even the ones who really believe, the hardcore believe-its, even they realized they were playing along with it. And by, I think, the late 80s, it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether you believed or didn't. It was perfectly accepted. Like I've told people for many, many, many years, look, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I know that ain't real. So what? So what if Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant wasn't real? That has nothing to do with how entertaining something is. Look at, you could even go so far as to say, not to be political because I'm not, but many people would say the mainstream news is perhaps a little worked in some aspects now. So, and I think it was much the way with wrestling. We play along. We want to believe. It's great if we can believe. The company, make it easier for us to believe, but it doesn't have to be a shoot fight. It doesn't have to be a boring, I loved UFC. I loved UFC early on. I'm not so much into it now, but early on, I thought it was great. Very entertaining. Was some of that worked? Mostly no, but there were an occasion. I was cage side with the press during that Mark Hall match against Don Fry, where he hurt his knee, but he didn't hurt his knee. And they come out later saying, he threw the fight. I was there. I got the picture. I'm the one that you've seen that photo. That's me. I took that photo. So in every aspect of a combat sport or entertainment in general, I think there is a set of fans who have, especially, man, when I was growing up, and they wanted to believe. And I don't care how ridiculous something looked on TV. They wanted to believe. And I think society worked its way out of that by the 80s. So the newsstand magazines, I actually think they were the victim to, obviously, the internet rising killed the magazines. But they had started really a decline before that. And I actually think that had more to do with the near monopolization of WWF, WWE than anything else. What else was there for a Pro Wrestling Illustrated to cover, or whatever? WWF had their own magazine. It was a very slick, good-looking magazine. Hard to compete with that. So I think that hurt them a lot too. I love the magazine. I love the newsstand magazines a lot. Matter of fact, right here, right beside me, 1973.
Nice.
So,
nice.
So love these old magazines because they're great to learn from. And so many people have kind of got forgotten in history, honestly. So many times I'll read some of these old magazines, I'll go, I'm supposed to be an expert. I've never heard of this cat from 1972 before. Who is this? And I love finding stuff like that. Find new things to look into.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the magazines. That was one of the major ways that I got to follow the territories pre-internet, and I think they certainly have a significant part in the promulgation of the business for a period of time. But you mentioned wanting to believe and suspending disbelief, so I got to ask you about this. I've heard Brian Alvarez talk about that angle where John Cena turned heel,
Right.
and a lot of people are saying greatest heel turn of all time. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that notwithstanding, um, The Rock in a presser went out immediately thereafter and basically said, do you like the story that we're telling? And I think that's kind of emblematic of a lot of people have known for a long time that the outcome was predetermined, whatever way you want to call it. But we still want to suspend disbelief. And when you have incidents like that, notwithstanding even what social media does, but right after a major angle, could he not have waited, a year or two, or dissecting it down? I know, Brian Alvarez commented on that extensively. What's your thoughts?
I'm going to probably be an outlier on this because I have a view of wrestling that I think differs from a lot of other people. I am like, this is going to seem like blasphemy to many wrestling fans. They're going to think, Karl, how could you ever think this? But I almost wish wrestling is so weird. Why can't we treat it just like a TV show we really love? Why do we have to always call Sting? Is he not actually Steve Borden, and he's an actor athlete playing the role of a character called Sting? That makes way more sense, because then you get guys like, Bill Eadie, for example, who's had 5 or 6 different gimmicks. You don't know what do I call him, masked superstar, and here's this 70-year-old man sitting there wearing a mask, and what. Now, no actor would do that. You don't call Nicolas Cage by some character name he played. Chris Evans isn't. You won't run into him and go, "Hey, Captain America." Why does wrestling still pretend to have one foot in each world? In a way, it's kind of fun. In a way, it's kind of ridiculous. And maybe wrestling sometimes ridiculous too. So maybe it's how it's supposed to be. But to me, I would just as soon. I didn't see this. I did read about it, but I would just as soon, them be up front and say, on our episode tonight, you saw John Cena 20 years too late turn heel. What did you guys think about that? And to me, honest to goodness, in 2025, I think it's a perfectly acceptable conversation to have. But I also realize I'm in the minority, that many people want to carry that belief in that fantasy beyond that to, like, well, I bet John Cena really could win a fight between. That's fine. I mean, it's part of the fun too. So I don't want to criticize it too much, but if it were left up to me, we would treat it wrestling just like a TV show or movie. And I wouldn't be calling Nicolas Cage Ghost Rider 30 years down the road. I would be saying, he's played this role, or Chris Evans, whoever the actor is. I wouldn't be calling them by their character name. That's just always seemed very ludicrous to me. But wrestling for so many years pretended to be real. Obviously, you weren't going to interview Bruno Sammartino circa 1960 something and him go, well, we had this show the other night and I thought the production values were. So part of the fun is also, how real is it? And I understand that. How real is it? Is John Cena, does he feel kind of some of these same ways he just said about the fans? That's part of the fun too. And I get it. It's just, to me, it's just, I don't know, it's like nothing else. And that's fun too.
Yeah, fair enough. In terms of particularly your work on the Pioneer era, what did your research process look like? Did you get right into that microfiche? And because obviously with the 80s, different ball of wax, in terms of documentation, but how did you really get that information that you needed?
Well, Jack, let me tell you, the book I just put out, which is Dragon King Karl's Pioneer Era Wrestling Omnibus, that book is 30 years in the making. When it started, it was absolutely going to libraries, looking on microfilm to see if anybody wrestled in this town in, 18 something. obviously there were many other historians who had information, and we shared them by way of newsletters and things like that back in the day. Used to be in the days before Observer and Torch and Figure 4, your big known newsletters, national newsletters, there were a plethora of smaller fanzines. And so a lot of your history was contained in these that, may have only sold, 20 copies in total, but historians managed to get a hold of them. Early on, as the internet was recognized by a lot of people as being a great place to store information long term for research purposes. That was before it became public. I mean, literally, that's what it was used for by the military and colleges. So all that information becomes uploaded over the years. And so, when I first started working on any of the Pioneer stuff was probably 1998. By 2001, I had written a booklet called the Pioneers Era Special, which is so full of misinformation now that I'm ashamed to say I ever wrote it, but that's all we knew. And we had the stories to go on. We have great historians. I'm not going to go through the list now because I'll forget many, but they're listed in the book. Those people are not just a list of people, my buddies. They're a list of people who have put in many, many hours of research going to these libraries and microfilm. Of course, nowadays you have many online archives. And so then it becomes just a patience game. How many different ways can I search this? What places was it popular? And then just a catch-all, let's just go to newspapers.com and put in wrestling and start in 18 whatever and work our way through it. And you'll run into many things where it's just, two people at a local bar got in a wrestling match, a fight or whatever. But then you find stuff that was never out there before. So much of the stuff that I have talked about over the years was unfortunately characterized with the lack of information out there. There's one very interesting story that comes from the Pioneer era. And once I sunk my teeth into this, I couldn't get back out of it. There is, and you certainly few people have ever heard the name Barney Smith. Okay, Barney Smith was a wrestler in the 1860s and 1870s. The first big tournament, where we get the rules established for what pro wrestling even is, was the 1870 Detroit International Tournament held in Detroit, Michigan. And it was nationally reported on. There was wrestling before that, for sure. And this was the foundational moment where we get what wrestling is. Colonel James H. McLaughlin is the guy who won that tournament. But the story since at least the 1930s has been a tragic, sympathetic story where Colonel McLaughlin beats Barney Smith in the finals of this tournament. It's for a great diamond championship belt. That part turns out to be true. But what turns out not to be true is that Colonel McLaughlin accidentally killed Barney Smith in this match. He hit his head. McLaughlin got mad because he said, I pinned this guy several times. The referees never call it, so I'm going to slam him good this time, and did so. And the next day, as the story was told, he was, quote, found wandering the streets in the rain in nothing but his underwear, and he was institutionalized where he passed away soon after of what we would now today recognize as a traumatic brain injury. Only that story has zero evidence that it ever happened. There was a Barney Smith wrestler, yes. He was in the Detroit tournament, yes. He wrestled Colonel James H. McLaughlin, yes, but he didn't even make it to the finals. And there's not a word about this in any of the newspapers. And so I checked every single day, Detroit Free Press News. Nothing about Barney Smith. You'd think they covered this tournament daily for 2 weeks. You would think they would mention this. I even looked at the weather report. It didn't even rain for more than a week in Detroit after that. So wandering around the rain, where? Thought, well, maybe he went back home to his home in Hamilton, Ontario. Nothing in the papers there. And in fact, I ended up finding Barney Smith still alive about 10 years later, the champion of one of the Dakotas, the Dakota Territory, I think. And he was just in a place nobody was reporting on him. And later on, a wrestler, McLaughlin never spoke about it either. There's numerous interviews with McLaughlin over the years. He never mentioned it. You'd think you'd mention it. He didn't. And so as it turns out, it was written about in a sports bulletin about 15 years after the fact. They mentioned this story. Who knows where they come up with it at? Did they fabricate it, invent it? Were they misunderstanding another story? I don't know, but the long told story of the demise of Barney Smith does not appear in any way to have taken place the way it's long been told. So to clear up misinformation like that, to who is this important? I don't know. To history, it's important. To the accurate documenting of the origin and evolution of pro wrestling, it's important. That's who it's important. It's important to me. So I wanted to make sure once I saw that, I'm like, well, what else do I think is true that's not? And so as I went forward, I made sure to keep out an eye for names that were more important than they've ever been given credit for, and also maybe people who were placed a little more important than they should be. And what I came to understand was there was a very vibrant, successful. They were drawing regularly 3,000 to 8,000 people. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. Tell me an independent today that wouldn't want to do those numbers in the 1860s. So immediately I'm like, well, why do we never hear about this stuff? Does nobody care about history? Well, obviously I know that's not true. Many people love history. History books, big sellers. So why not this? And to me, I learned so much about today's wrestling by investigating how it all started. And now I understand little nuances that I never even understood hanging around, the veterans who at that time, the people I was in a locker room with were people, like I said, Ken Timms and Mike Jackson, and Bull Buchanan was just coming up, and Hector Guerrero and people like that were the ones I was listening to. Well, they didn't know what was going on in the 1800s either. So, but now I understand where some of the things they knew about had originated. And I don't know, it gave a more understanding depth to, I guess, the entirety of professional wrestling that I ever knew before.
Yeah, along those lines, a fan on social media sent a question for me to ask you, and if you could pick one wrestler who kind of got forgotten in the sands of time and history that deserves more attention, who would that be?
From the territorial era, I'm going to call out my personal favorite wrestler, Mr. Olympia, Jerry Stubbs. Jerry Stubbs was great. You watch him in Mid-South, you watch him especially in Southeastern. And see, I think that's the problem. There's so much in Southeastern stuff that's not out there. People see him as this very in shape, very good wrestler in Mid-South, teaming with Junkyard Dog and Ted DiBiase, and in a feud with Mr. Wrestling 2. And he seems like this very competent wrestler in very good shape, not a lot to say. Jerry Stubbs was a great promo, incredible promo. And he worked best in these Southern territories. In fact, he never really went out anywhere else. And I don't think he would have translated much. He was, and they teamed together. He's very similar to Arn Anderson. And I think Arn Anderson picked up a lot of stuff from him. And I think he's overlooked a lot. Like, I'm not saying, man, if only WWF had hired Jerry Stubbs, he'd been world champion, nothing like that. But he's definitely an overlooked talent. As far as the overall of all time of wrestling, to me, I have to go back again to the Pioneer era. And I have to say that many people who are just, want to know about wrestling history probably know who William Muldoon is, but may not know who Colonel James H. McLaughlin is. And I think that's too bad, because I think McLaughlin, while I would not rank him above Muldoon in terms of influence and importance in pro wrestling history, he's much closer than people give him credit for. He's very, very, very important, especially early on. Muldoon's career wasn't super long. I mean, it was only about 10 years or so. And he primarily, I would guess, 90% worked what was called Greco-Roman. And Greco-Roman is not what you think of today. You think, well, that's the Olympic wrestling. That's a collegiate style, old holds above the waist and whatever. I think Brock Lesnar was great at it. That was not the collar, and that was not the that was not the Greco-Roman of the Pioneer era. Greco-Roman Pioneer era was literally them putting on a play saying, look what the ancient Romans did. This is their gladiatorial battles. Let us meet these two Frenchmen, not nobody from Rome, but they're going to Greco-Roman for us. They're going to show us what the Greeks and the Romans did back in the original Olympics. And that's where you get your Bowers and Muldoons and Millers. And like Muldoon was taught directly by Professor William Miller. And so he got the original teaching, but what he did was so brilliant. And I don't know that wrestling would be here without William Muldoon, because when William Muldoon come along, the newspapers and the public thought wrestling was a joke for illiterate gamblers. It was come on, this is a sinful pastime. You idiots are betting money on something. They're obviously taking your money with this Greco-Roman stuff. Now, collar and elbow had a better reputation. Certainly, catch as catch can was considered dangerous and a more close relative, I guess, to mixed martial arts than anything. But Greco-Roman wrestling back then, to make no mistake, it was show wrestling. And William Muldoon come along and was a tough guy. He was a real tough guy. New York City police officer, and strong. He supposedly, and I don't know how accurate this story is. It's an oft-repeated story, but he was too young to be in the Civil War, so he volunteered to be the little marching drummer, flag bearer guy. Not even armed. He's out there, this tenacious would be a good way to describe it. And so when he came along, he was also smart in that he realized nobody believes this stuff. So I'm going to educate them. And William Muldoon toured the country, the entire country, from coast to coast in much in Middle America, with a troupe of revolving wrestlers. Sometimes it was Clarence Whistler, sometimes it was Andre Cristal, sometimes it was others. But he went around to opera houses and arenas putting on exhibitions. And so you knew you were getting a fake fight to begin with, but it was an instructional fake fight. They would have a fall, and then Muldoon would stand up and address the crowd and say, what you just saw here was, the use of this hold. And when he got me this way, I turned my weight and brought physical culturism into it that made it interesting for people. Now I'm not getting fleeced out of my money. I'm buying a ticket for this very educational athletic show. And he really rebuilt the reputation of wrestling all over the country just simply by going arena to arena and going, let me show you this fake match, but let me show you how it works in reality. And goes out and everybody thinks, man, Muldoon's just this tough guy. Look at that hold there would work in the real world. That was a cost in the barn. And so, he's showing people he's legitimate in a worked context, which is exactly what pro wrestling was in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Tough people going, let's put on this show for you to show you how tough I might really be. Muldoon started that, and wrestling really got very popular under him. He really changed just, there were a lot of scoundrels and there's still very much the gap going on back then. But Muldoon really changed how people viewed wrestling. And I think from there all the way up through Gotch and Hackenschmidt, which was, the essentially, 30 years on down the road, he made people believers by literally telling them it's fake, but watch this. It's like martial arts karate demonstrations or something like that. A controlled demonstration. And so you can't take away any influence he had. He's hugely, McLaughlin came along a little before Muldoon, as did John McMahon. They were your two big ones up till he came along, but Muldoon really did make. I don't know that wrestling wouldn't have come along in some other form, probably would have, but he's certainly responsible for it going in the direction of entertainment, but make believe real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. as well as anyone, that wrestling fans can be very, passionate and opinionated, and that's kind of what makes the discourse interesting at times. But speaking mostly about your podcast work, how do you handle pushbacks from your listeners about specifically historical takes when they think, for example, Karl, you got this all wrong, blah blah blah. Like, do you roll with that? I've heard you. I won't spoil it, but I've heard you respond a number of times, and think that's definitely the way to handle it. But how do you?
The same way I would handle it if I'm investigating a crime and somebody come along and said, "You're all wrong about this, stupid." I would look at the evidence, and maybe they're right. I'm not infallible. The Barney Smith story taught me a lot. I've been repeating that story since 1998. Now I know it not to be true. I'm not repeating it anymore. And I very much straightforward in my book said, look, if you've heard me speak on Barney Smith before, forget everything I said, because now I know more. And I would say the same thing. Again, people find pop culture fun for different reasons, wrestling in particular. Everybody's got something they like. Who am I to criticize what somebody likes? It's subjective. The things I like, you may not like. Things they like, I may not like. It doesn't matter. But it's great if everybody finds something they do like about it. And I'm in no place to criticize that. And certainly there are many eras and time periods where I've not studied that deeply. I mean, the 1940s and 50s and even the 60s, I would defer to many people wiser than I am in those areas. And the whole entire Pioneer book is built on I like to consider myself more of a chronicler than necessarily a historian, because history is really, what are we doing? We're going around chronicling information reported by other people and sources. So I guess I am a wrestling historian because that's what everybody calls me. So I'll accept that label, but I really personally view myself as a chronicler. I don't know if you recall a book that was out in the early 2000s. It was an independently published book, but it was a godsend for researchers and investigators, called Pro Wrestling Title Histories. And there were 4 volumes of it. They were written by a couple guys named Royal Duncan and Gary Will. And one of those two, I forget which one, said, there is no history if no one writes it down. And that's true. The only way we know about history is somebody chronicling that. And that's kind of what I have always felt like my role was. And could some of my sources be incorrect? Absolutely. Let's look into that and find out what the real story is. So that's how I would address that. In matters of subjectivity, nobody's right and wrong. You either like it or dislike it, and that's fine. There's no right or wrong there. In matters of historical accuracy, there's much room for misinterpretation. Original source is wrong. This reminds me of a very comical and interesting story, again from the I think this was 1880s. The newspapers all across the United States ran the headline, McMahon wrestler killed in shooting in, I think it was Colorado. And so obviously, if you're alive at that time, you think John McMahon has been killed in a shooting in Colorado. The story even sounds like it. And the newspaper asked, does anybody out there know if this was John McMahon, the famous wrestler? Okay, it wasn't. But you talk about serendipity. A month later, John McMahon was shot in San Francisco after throwing a wrestling match, and a gambler lost some money and come up and shot him multiple times. One went in his chest, one went in his abdomen. He was in newspapers terms, critical care. He also wrestled a 40-minute match 3 weeks later. Who can make that up? That's incredible. So if you reported at the time that McMahon was shot, you may or may not have been right. You were right in some instances, but maybe not the one you thought you were correct in. And how many other stories probably, in my law enforcement career, I saw many times, it wasn't that we were all out there getting, innocent people and throwing them in jail, but you would run across many people who they seemed guilty, who were not. You get to looking at the story and really putting it in. And so many times investigators, not to get on a law enforcement tangent, I left that world. I retired last year, and let's leave it there. But at the same time, I know these things and the way the system works. There's so many times law enforcement is criticized, rightfully so, by having blinders on. We only see this one person. You didn't investigate every single other person in the world who might have also done this murder. But, you go where the evidence leads. But many times, how many times do we know of where it was that other person? It was somebody else. And you can't have blinders on. You can never have blinders on. It's whether you're a researcher and even as a fan, I would say don't dismiss some wrestling style or wrestling promotion or wrestling personality without giving it a chance. You may be surprised what you would find out there. Some of the most, obviously as a guy who's in my 50s, who was a fan in the 80s and 90s, I often get, I hate this wrestling nowadays. It's so whatever. I've never felt that's even appropriate. I mean, it's not for you. Could be for somebody else. Probably is. And thank goodness it is, because the business is doing quite well in many aspects. And it's always very interesting. So many times people have counted wrestling out, figuratively speaking, and said, there's no way it recovered. Look at all the scandals in the early 90s. How did it survive? How did it get by the Chris Benoit stuff? That darn near collapsed the business. I met Chris Benoit exactly one time in my life. I had dinner with him. I was working on the WCW lawsuit about the minority wrestlers who sued Turner Sports.
Racial discrimination.
That's right. Yes. So I was hired by the law firm of Meadows, Ichter, and Trigg in Georgia. And many people may remember Kerry Ichter as Chris Benoit's father's attorney after the fact. So he was on TV many times making statements. Okay, I worked for him in a investigative capacity. My job wasn't to form an opinion. My job was to gather statistics that they would then try, obviously, to use to show some sort of discrimination. So that's what they paid me to do it. And so I did it to the best of my ability. But in one of those meetings in Atlanta, I sat down with Chris Benoit and Nancy there. And then it was just literally, I don't remember the exact time frame, but it wasn't years later that this all happened. And that was how does a business come back from that? But it did, because he was considered, gosh, the best in the world. I mean, there's so many of the hardcore fans just considered him the apex of what a wrestler could be. And for everybody then to have to go, I can't even watch that anymore. It was a tough one to come back from, tougher than I think people really consider. I was just starting the pod. I'd previously had the podcast going at my own website, and I started with Observer at the time. So as Dave Meltzer and Brian Alvarez and all those are on Nancy Grace and stuff like that, I'm having to keep up with all this unfolding to stay relevant. I've just got thrown into the thing there, and some would argue, and I don't know, wrongfully so, that it never did fully recover from that. Has wrestling ever been as popular as it was pre that? I mean, there's mixed metrics, but I would say it took a bite out of the popularity of wrestling.
Anything about his conduct or his interactions with Nancy during that dinner that you found unusual or concerning?
No, I mean, I wish I had some great revelation that, here's this seasoned, at that point in time, I had 15 or 16 years in, the seasoned investigator sitting across from a, future double murderer. You would have thought I would pick up on something, but I'm going to be honest with you, I didn't pick up on anything other than he's a shy, quiet guy like many other shy, quiet guys I know. And I didn't feel like he was particularly awkward in any sort of way. The attorneys, I felt, not Kerry Ichter himself. I thought he was great, but some of the hanger-ons around there, I felt like they had a very negative view of wrestling in general. In fact, one of them even made the statements, these aren't rocket scientists we're dealing with here. And I thought that was very unfair. While that may be true with some people, like in any other job, there are many very intelligent people in wrestling, as I'm sure you've known and met many people smarter than the average person that just because wrestling is different and unique from any other sport does not make it dumb or silly or anything like that. It makes it unique, and that's good. That's a good thing.
You've mentioned the years that you've worked with Dave Meltzer and the Wrestling Observer. I have to ask you, because we're in the season of the WWE Hall of Fame. I find the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame to be a really interesting entity in terms of the process, the voting, and the debates that have popped up. It seems year after year. You recently did a show where you talked about Tully and Arn with JJ Dillon and how that impacts their eligibility, for lack of a better word, and then Ole Anderson and Big Daddy. You could list these names. What in terms of that Hall of Fame, what do you think sets it apart from, say, the WWE Hall of Fame and other Hall of Fames, and why do you think? Fans speculate about, well, this guy's definitely Hall of Fame worthy or not, but I've never seen the level of detail and intricacy in terms of the Observer discussions. And last part of that long-winded question, what, in terms of Dave and his influence, it's his baby, he's the godfather. How do you think that the Observer Hall of Fame as the WWE was colored by McMahon?
Well, I want to be very careful what I say here, because Dave's a very divisive person. Let's just be honest. In this world today, there are many people who probably will not listen to the thing I say if I compliment Dave. But I'm going to just tell you the truth as I know it. I don't know Dave on a personal level like we've ever hung out or anything, but I've obviously known and worked with him and corresponded with him for many years. And he very much has a style of wrestling that he really likes and is really probably the foremost expert in the world on it. Certainly when it comes to historical matters and their place of fitting in history, Dave's hard to beat. Now, I can't speak on all the arguments that go on social media between, this group of fans and that group of fans and whatever. Everybody's got the reason. I wish we could just everybody get along and like what they like, but I don't always agree with Dave. In fact, very frequently do I disagree with him, because we like wrestling for different reasons. He has, for lack of a better term, I feel like Dave has a type. Brian Pillman, Kenny Omega, the Super Juniors of that era. Tiger Mask. Oh my goodness, he was. I just have recently been going through some of those old Tiger Mask, Sayama era observers, and of course he was great and he was right. But Dave was enamored by that style of wrestling, Dynamite Kid and people like that. I love that stuff too. One of my favorite wrestlers is Jushin Thunder Liger. I love Liger, but I am drawn to wrestling for more of the soap opera aspect. I grew up watching Southeastern in Memphis. To me, that's wrestling. It's storytelling with physicality. I think Dave much prefers the in-ring athletic acumen of the wrestlers that are there, and that's fine. That's a perfectly good metric if that's what you like. So oftentimes I find myself disagreeing with Dave, especially since Dave continues to report on current modern day wrestling, and I don't so much. So we oftentimes greatly differ on the Hall of Fame, and that's fine. I have said this. I had rather the Observer and WWE Hall of Fame are apples and oranges. Okay, but neither's worse than the other. That are different. I've known so many people that Bob Armstrong was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And, it was a great honor, to be respected by your peers, to get this, even though we obviously say there are many lower qualified people in the WWE Hall of Fame, but for their purpose to market and monetize, I think it's great. I think it's fine. No problem at all. Give these people a night to honor them and look back on their career. I think it's great. The Observer and some of the other independent Hall of Fames is a much different thing. It's journalistic criteria. It's much more heavily researched. And there's a lot of people that aren't in it that people would think should be in it. But I would argue it's much better to have a Hall of Fame that is very hard to get into than one populated by a lot of people who maybe aren't, of the best caliber. And so I like the gatekeeping with the Observer Hall of Fame, even though I get absolutely, utterly frustrated with some people who, to me, are no-brainers. And I feel like if their emphasis was more on the in-ring stuff and less on the entertainment stuff, they might have been in. Sting comes to mind as one example, although he ultimately got in. Even the Rock and Roll Express, which I thought is a no-brainer to me, goodness gracious, how many Rock and Roll Express knockoffs have there been since, the mid-1980s? Many. And we all know Ricky Morton is just, maybe in terms of selling an offense in a match, if there's any better, I don't know who they are. So they took forever to get them in, too, to be voted in. Even one that I thought, and I actually got angry about this one, was Antonino Rocca and Miguel Perez. Again, not my era of expertise, but I've done a lot of research on it enough to know that you put Rocca and Perez on a Madison Square Garden show, that attendance instantly goes up in the multiple thousands. It's obvious. You see it with your eyes. And how they got in the second year, but the first year they weren't. And still this day, I just don't understand that. But we're, WWE's in their season. I saw, some press releases on some of the, obviously the Natural Disasters, probably not a team that's getting into the Observer Hall of Fame because they're entertainment based, large guys. Earthquake might have a stand, but John Teno may stand a better chance in the Observer Hall of Fame than would Tugboat or Typhoon, Fred Ottman. But for WWF, of course, WWE, of course. Why wouldn't you put the Natural Disasters in? Many kids love the Natural Disasters when they come out. I was an adult and I liked them. I thought John Teno was great. So it's different things, and I don't think it's necessary to compare them to one to another because the comparisons to me just don't work out. I would never vote for, and I hate to say this, I would never vote for Bob Armstrong in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame. He didn't have enough of a national career. His metrics just don't line up. In an Alabama Sports Hall of Fame, heck yeah, absolutely. In the WWE Hall of Fame, even though he didn't work there, sure, it's fine. It wasn't that he wasn't one of the best wrestlers I ever saw, but he didn't have the national metrics. And so I think these things need to be judged by the standard for which the Hall of Fame is. WWF's, or WWE, sorry, old habits, WWE, their Hall of Fame is, largely for years was chosen just by Vince McMahon, whoever he happened to be thinking about at that moment. Now, I don't really know what the process is, but it still appears to be, let's pick some of the more popular people from our past that we can monetize through an action figure or some sort of documentary series. And there's nothing wrong with that. I can't wait to see the Natural Disasters, special on TV. I'm sure there'll be one, and I'll be glad to watch it. So,
well, I heard you put a very eloquent segment on your podcast. We're not going to get bogged down in this, but on Ole Anderson, and I understand your argument, but I completely disagree. Just in terms of larger than, I mean, depending on the criteria, and that's the beauty, as you say, of the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, that there actually is criteria. And I understand that Ole didn't meet that national run, length, world champion, blah, blah, blah. But in terms of just personality and his work as a, with Georgia and booking and with the Wrecking Crew and helping Arn come along, I definitely think he did have a Hall of Fame career. But I mean, that's also part of what makes it fun. But I always think that the Observer has it over the WWE Hall of Fame because Dave made it very clear. And every time there's a discussion, these are the criteria. And there's people that take too long or slip through the cracks but don't get in. But at least there is actual objective criteria, unlike the other version. Ivan wants to ask who, in your view, might be getting in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame this year.
The ballot is a tough one coming up. Now, obviously, we haven't gotten it yet. It's not that time yet for Observer. It just was a few months ago. But I don't see I can't speak on the more modern guys. And there's several that are coming, like Young Bucks and stuff. They recently got in there. I'm not an expert on that, and I'm not qualified to speak on that. But for the others, there's nobody right this moment that just jumps out. But I will say this. I wrote up a proposal, 10 years or so ago now, myself and Matt Farmer. We wrote to get Colonel James H. McLaughlin in the Hall of Fame and did so. And this year, I'm very seriously considering writing up one for Professor Theobald Bauer, now that I know how important he was in introducing entertainment-style wrestling, which is oftentimes the last thing you want to suggest to the observer, that the entertainment aspect overshadows his in-ring. And I don't think Bauer was probably that tough a guy. I mean, I'm just seeing some of the things that did happen to him that were legitimate. I don't know that he was the scariest dude in town, but he was very entertaining. And I think I can make a case for him. But to your point on Ole Anderson, I love, anytime somebody challenges, absolutely, please write up something, send it to me, and I'll be glad to understand, because I will say this: a Hall of Fame where Ole Anderson is borderline, that's a heck of a Hall of Fame right there. So that's my feeling on that.
Yeah, very, very, very good point. You also run the When It Was Cool podcast network Empire, and you cover topics outside of wrestling. How do you decide on those topics to explore outside of the squared circle?
Well, I go by the old and probably poor business model of I talk about what I like because I feel like I would have passion. And, if I happen to have just watched an old TV show and go, well, I really like that show, I think I'll talk about it. That kind of thing. When It Was Cool was my attempt starting in 2016 or actually 2017 when we launched, was my attempt to hedge the bets against the future of the wrestling business, which I saw the popularity declining significantly. And so, at that time I had a career. I wasn't retired yet. And as my, in modern day language, my side gig was doing wrestling podcasts, something I was passionately involved in. Well, as the popularity of wrestling, especially, a few years ago, really started to decline, and that dates all the way back to the ending days of WCW. We lost millions of fans. We never recovered. And so we can't afford to be shedding off hundreds of thousands now as broadcast TV transitions from satellite TV cable to streaming, which is kind of where we're caught up in now. We're all sports, many sports, I would say all sports, many sports are struggling with the same things wrestling are, keeping our audience in new ways. And that's good. So I was doing the same thing. I thought, well, I grew up liking comic books. I grew up, watching TV shows as I was a kid, and movies, and, action figures, collectibles, things like that. There are markets for these, very healthy markets. So let's see how this will go. And so far, When It Was Cool, the website's been very successful. Our podcast network, is, yes, it leans very heavily wrestling, but that's because most people who come there to begin with were wrestling fans. And so we have a show now on Southeastern Championship Wrestling done by a guy named Aaron Gartland, who lives down in Dothan and grew up there watching that. So we have that show. We have another show, Eric Darcy's Wrestling with the Dog. And plus, I do a couple shows a week. So right there is like 4 days out of the week wrestling. And then I try to mix in TV, horror, comics, things like that. And when I say comic books, obviously I realize nobody reads comic books anymore, but those intellectual properties are huge. You certainly have seen the Avengers movies. You certainly probably saw, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Well, those intellectual properties came from the comic book. And so to talk in a larger pop culture context, these are comic book characters. And so much of what, Walking Dead, that was a comic book property. And so I try to look at things from that perspective of not say, oh, this, issue number, whatever, this comic book was really great or bad. It's not about that. It's about the intellectual property. One I'm exploring right now, just started, is Superman. We're going to do a chronological look at Superman from 1938 forward and see how he changed. So I just got finished doing that with Batman. And if I told people nowadays, if I tell you, obviously, Jack, you're very educated on wrestling, and people watching this know it, I could tell you, hey, did you know wrestling in the 1800s was probably fake, a lot of it too? You might say, well, I'm not totally surprised, and tell me more. But, on the other side, on the flip side, in the comic book world, obviously nobody reads comics today, but that intellectual property touches people from all kinds of aspects. And so I try to have fun with that and maybe get in a new set of fans, so I'm not just so reliant on the ups and downs, ebbs and flows of the wrestling business. And as we all get older, look, more and more of fans that are like, my age are all together leaving wrestling because it's not what we remember and want. And many went toward UFC and MMA, especially 10, 15 years ago. Many left going that direction. And now today it's a huge market that you're competing with football. You're competing with mixed martial arts. You're competing with, all these different shows streaming at your fingertips, this instant access world. That's new media, and that's where we are. And you either adapt and overcome, or you get left behind. And even though I look like I may have been left behind by, the 1800s, I am in fact aware of these trends and want to keep up with them and be relevant and keep our content relevant. And let's face it, many wrestling fans are passionate fans. You may in fact listen to 6 or 8 podcasts about wrestling, but like any other human being, you may need a break for a minute. So, hey, come listen to this collectible show for a second, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes extremely sound business sense. Diversification is never a bad thing. Karl, we've blown through our time here as I expected. I feel like we've only somewhat scratched the surface. But before we get into where the fans can find you on social media, find your websites and other projects that you have on the go that they should be aware of, what's next for you in terms of, do you have anything germinating in your mind in terms of a book? I know you're talking about When It Was Cool, but any major projects that you may have on the go that you're excited about?
Yeah, I think so, Jack, and I really appreciate you asking, because right now, clearly because the Pioneer Era Wrestling Omnibus just came out at the end of last year, I'm in full-fledged mode, really pushing it anywhere it can. It's very important to me personally for this book to do very well, because I do consider this particular book, and it's the third one I've done. I've done a 1983 Omnibus and the 84-85, which you also mentioned. The Pioneer one is my life's work. It's the one I've put the most passion and years into. So when my funeral or whatever, put on my tombstone, he got to write that Pioneer book, because that's the thing. And so I would love anybody to check that out. All of the links to everything I do, including, and very important, we monetize our website by Patreon. And so we have over 2,500 podcasts on there right now. That's just podcasts. That's not to count the books and periodicals I've got on there and everything else. So if people have a little opportunity and can just check us out and maybe give us some, $5 for 1 month. I can't even do anything at McDonald's with $5 anymore, but you could try us out. Cancel if you don't like what you see, but I bet you'll find some stuff you'll like to listen to, and check it out. And really, our Patreon and the Pioneer Era book is the most important thing of the moment. After this, the next big project, obviously I've got to be thinking toward my next omnibus book, which would probably pick up in 86, 87, maybe. That's if I'm toying with anything, it would be that, because I've got a substantial amount of that already put together. It just has to be, finished off, and whatever. It'd take me about 6 months or so to get everything in order to put that out, and that might be something to look for next year. But this year is the year of the pioneer. I want the pioneers to finally get their moment.
Well, where can the fans find you on all social media? Where can they hit up that Patreon? I just want to say I came across your work several years ago. Well worth the money. You clearly put in a lot of time and hours in the product that you're putting out there. Highly educational. Can't recommend it enough. Where can the fans find all your good stuff?
Literally, the easiest way to find a link to everything I do is whenitwascool.com. That'll put you to all of our latest shows, a Patreon page, anything I'm doing at Observer, which is usually twice a week. I do a show over there. If they would kindly bookmark whenitwascool.com, and we got plenty of free articles and stuff on there too. Just browse around and see what you like, and I appreciate it. And Jack, thank you so much for allowing me to mention that. And again, I'm honored to be on Hannibal TV. I think this is great. I've watched many hours on Hannibal TV of various different topics, and it's fantastic. I mean, this stuff like this, Hannibal TV, it's channels like this that keep wrestling alive and going. We, the fans, are not Dave Meltzer, not Brian Alvarez, not even Vince McMahon, not The Rock. It's you, Jack, also, but you listening, you watching. That's what keeps professional wrestling alive and well. And let's keep supporting projects just like Hannibal TV. And if you can stop by my site and check it out, I would greatly appreciate it too. But we're the ones that keep it alive.
Yeah, I think we share that passion in terms of document. As you said, history doesn't exist unless it's written down. Now we're in the digital age. We spend a lot of time on the Hannibal TV talking to, interviewing figures who play a part in the business. They may not have been, in the national spotlight, but my personal passion is the territories and interviewing as many of those folks as I can. And I know you share that, but want to thank you very much again for coming on the Great North Wrestling Podcast, Karl.
I am utterly honored and greatly appreciative, and thank you all so much. And Jack, thank you so much for having me here. It's been an honor.
Well, fans, that's it for another edition of the Great North Wrestling Podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel, like this video if you enjoyed it, and also hit that notification button so you don't miss tremendous content like this. Until next time, I'm Jack Kilby. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates.